My name is Oswin Marable, and for 41 years I was the senior clock keeper to the House of Briarcliffe. The office is hereditary. My father held it before me, his father before him, and on Friday of next week I will formally place it in the hands of my son. Before I do, I want to tell you about a Tuesday morning 4 years ago at 3 o'clock, when a single chime that did not sound nearly ended me, and a quiet man at a quiet post saved everything I had inherited. I was 66 that winter, and I should not have been ill. I had not missed a quarterly inspection in 38 years. But the fever came down on me on the Monday evening like weather, the kind that sets your bones humming, and by 10 o'clock I was in my bed in the keeper's lodge below the north tower with the small bedside regulator ticking on the floor beside me. The regulator is a habit. The pendulum on it is 12 inches, the pendulum on the tower above me is 12 feet. They are tuned to each other. When I am well, I do not hear either of them. When I am ill, I hear nothing else. I lay there and listened to the small one swing, and I listened, through the open casement, for the great one above to chime the hour. The night was cold and very clear, the city below the palace asleep under a coat of frost, and at 2 o'clock the tower made its 2 slow strokes, and I felt them in the boards of the lodge floor. They were perfect. Of course they were perfect. The North Tower clock had chimed every hour on the hour for 200 years. It was set in motion on a November afternoon by a man whose name is cut into the brass baseplate of the escapement housing in a careful italic hand. The mechanism has not stopped since. It has been wound by a Marable twice weekly every week for 2 centuries. A tradition like that is not maintained by miracle. It is maintained by no one breaking it. In my fever I considered, for a half-mad quarter of an hour, climbing the 204 stairs myself, steadying on the brass handrail a stair at a time. The thought was not rational. By the time my mind cleared enough to know it, the chamber felt as remote to me as the moon. I gave it up. I rang for the junior instead. Then I made my mistake. I have replayed it many times. My junior in those years was a careful young man named Tobias who slept in the small room above the workshop and who had served under me for 6.5 years. He knew the mechanism. What I had not yet trained into him, what no clock keeper learns in fewer than 10 years, was the deep instinct of the office. The instinct that says, when something must be done quickly, you stop and you tell someone first. The mechanism is older than your career. You do not touch it alone in the night. I rang the bell pull for Tobias at 2:30. He came down in his shirt sleeves, his face creased with sleep, and I told him what I felt, that the cold was sharper than the gauges had predicted, that the long pendulum would be running a hair fast by morning, that he should climb to the chamber and look at the regulator before dawn. I told him to telephone the master of the household's clerk if he was uncertain about anything at all. I did not tell him what he was about to discover when he climbed the 204 stone stairs and opened the chamber door. I did not warn him that the cold had already done more than the gauges said, that the great escapement had drifted further than any regulator tap could correct, and that the only honest fix would take longer than the hour he had. I did not warn him because in my fever I had not thought it through. I sent him up half-blind. That is the part I have to live with. He climbed. I lay in the lodge and listened to the small regulator and waited for the tower to chime 3. It did not chime 3. I learned later in pieces what had happened. Tobias reached the chamber at 2 minutes to 3. He saw at once that the escapement had slipped beyond the regulator's reach. He had 2 choices. He could let the clock chime 3 on its present setting, knowing it would run 2 minutes late until I came up in the morning. Or he could stop the pendulum, perform the small adjustment, and start it again on the true second. He stood for 40 seconds with his hand on the brass rail, breathing the cold metallic air, and he chose to stop the pendulum. He chose to stop the pendulum because he had been taught by his father, a watchmaker, that a clock running late is a worse failure than a clock briefly silent. He chose for love of the work. He chose wrongly. He stopped the pendulum at 2 minutes and 11 seconds to 3. He worked the small key, made the adjustment, and started the pendulum again at 38 seconds past 3. The whole interval was, by the chamber's own brass log, 90 seconds. The chamber was silent for 90 seconds. The hour did not strike. I should pause on that silence. In the chamber, when the pendulum is stopped, the room becomes a different room. The slow, controlled meshing of the gears that has been its only sound for 2 centuries simply ceases. The air settles. My father told me he heard that silence once for the 11 seconds of an authorized winter adjustment in 1973, and he said it was the longest 11 seconds of his life. Tobias heard 90 seconds of it alone. He told me later that during the last 20 seconds, with the pendulum motionless under his hand, he understood what he had done and was already too far in to undo it. He climbed down the 204 stairs in the dark, sat at his workbench in the lodge for the rest of the night without sleeping, and at 6 o'clock he brought me my tea and told me the clock was running fine. He did not lie to me directly. He simply did not say what he had done. He hoped in the way the young hope that nothing else hung on it. Something else hung on it. A man named Aldred Pell, royal guardsman of the Briarcliffe household foot, had stood that hour at his post in the North Court. I have never met Guardsman Pell more than 3 times in my life. He was a tall, lean man then in his middle 40s, with the kind of face that holds still by long discipline, and he had served at the North Court for 11 years. The North Court is the inner cobblestone forecourt under the shadow of the tower, the quietest post in the household. The overnight rotation sees no tourists, no traffic, almost no movement except the wind off the river and the hourly chime of the clock above. A guardsman who stands that post for 11 years does not merely hear the chime. He learns it the way the city's bus drivers learn the lights, not as a sound to be heard, but as a rhythm to be inhabited. The chime at the 3rd hour is 2 strokes lower in pitch than the chime at the 2nd, because of the way the bronze of the smaller bell catches the cold at depth of night. He had heard that distinction 4,000 times. At 3 o'clock he heard nothing. The silence was not a long silence. It was the length of 1 stroke that did not fall. But to a man who has stood in that court for 11 years on the overnight rotation, the absence of that stroke at that hour was as loud as if the tower itself had moved. He had heard the 3 o'clock chime through 11 New Years, through the night the river flooded, and the chamber's bronze had gone tin flat for an hour before steadying, through 1 funeral procession that wound past the North Court at 3:30 on a wet October morning. The chime was not, to him, a fact about a clock. It was the shape of a particular minute of his life, repeated 4,000 times, and the shape had a corner missing. He did not move. He stood his post in his red wool tunic and his tall bearskin, eyes forward, white gloves at the seam, and he kept his post for the remaining 3 hours of his watch. He did not turn his head toward the tower. When he was relieved at 6 o'clock, he saluted his replacement, walked the short distance to the guardroom, and there, in the quiet half-light before breakfast, he sat down at the small clerk's desk and wrote a single sealed memo to the master of the household. I have a copy of that memo in the bottom drawer of my workbench. Tobias has his own copy. The master kept the original. I will tell you what it said because it is short. Sir, I respectfully report that at 300 hours last Tuesday the North Tower clock did not chime the hour. I am familiar with the pattern of the chimes from 11 years on the post, and I am confident of the observation. I do not know the cause. I report it because it may matter. Yours faithfully, Aldred Pell, Royal Guardsman, Briarcliffe household foot. The memo reached the master's desk at 7:30 that morning. The master was a man named Sir Havard Cresswell, who had been 40 years in household service, and who had read 3 memos like that in the course of his career, each from a long-serving man at a quiet post, each ending with the line, I report it because it may matter, each uncovering in time something serious the household would otherwise have missed. He had learned by the 3rd one that quiet reports from long-serving men are the most important kind of report the household ever receives. He read this 4th one twice. He set down his coffee. He walked across the inner court, climbed the 204 stairs of the North Tower himself, and opened the chamber door. Tobias was already there. He had gone up at first light to verify his adjustment. When he saw the master in the chamber doorway, a heavy man in a dark coat, breathing a little hard from the climb, he understood at once that he had been found out. He sat down on the small oak stool by the pendulum housing. The chamber around him was as it had been since 1822, the brass gears wheeling in their slow, controlled meshing, the long oak pendulum rod swinging in its 12-foot arc, the 4 moonlight slits high in the stone walls letting the cold January air through in pale knife edges. He confessed everything within 10 minutes. He did not weep. He did not minimize. He named the exact second he had stopped the pendulum, the exact second he had restarted it, and the interval he had written into the chamber's brass log himself, 90 seconds. The master listened without interruption. He did not sit. He stood in the chamber doorway and he watched the long pendulum swing while Tobias spoke. When Tobias was done, the master asked him exactly 1 question. He asked who else knew. Tobias said, only the senior keeper, who was ill and who had sent him up without knowing what would be required. The master nodded once and walked down the stairs. He came to my lodge at 9. I was sitting up by then, weak but no longer feverish. He told me what had happened and what Tobias had done and what the guardsman had written. He told me nothing of his own opinion. He asked me whether I felt the office had been brought into disgrace. I said yes. He asked me whether I felt the disgrace was Tobias's. I said no. I said the disgrace was mine for sending him up half-blind. He listened. He left. The rest of that Wednesday and the whole of Thursday I spent in the keeper's lodge alone. Tobias did not come down. He stayed in the workshop above me, and from time to time I heard the slow tap of his hammer on a small brass piece, the way a man works when his hands need to do something while his mind cannot yet bear what it has done. I did not call him. I needed to compose the letter I knew I had to write, and I could not compose it with him in the room. I wrote 4 drafts of it on the Wednesday night and burned them all in the small grate. I wrote the 5th on the Thursday morning. That was the one I carried to the master. On the Friday of that week I was well enough to walk. I dressed in my dark keeper's coat, and I walked to the master's office across the inner court, and I asked his clerk to convey my formal resignation. The clerk asked me to wait. The master came out, took the letter from my hand, read it, folded it once and gave it back to me. He said, "Mr. Marrable, the hereditary office of clock keeper to the House of Briarcliffe has not been refused since 1822. I will not be the master who accepts it. Go home, eat, be well by Monday, the chamber needs you." I went home, I ate, I was well by Monday. On the Saturday, while I was still at home, the master wrote a letter of his own. He wrote it on a single sheet of the household's plain paper, and he had it hand-delivered by a steward to the quarters of guardsman Aldred Pell. The letter was 1 line long. I learned the line later because Pell, who is a private man, mentioned it only once to his sergeant, who mentioned it only once to me, 6 months afterwards in a corridor. The line read, "Your 11 years are heard, Cresswell." Pell folded the letter, placed it in the inside pocket of his tunic, and went on his next watch that evening. He has not spoken of it since. The household revised its protocol within the month. The old standing order that the senior keeper could send the junior up alone if the senior were incapacitated was struck. The new order, which still stands, requires that any unscheduled work on the tower mechanism between the hours of midnight and dawn be telephoned in advance to the master's night clerk, who logs the interval and notifies the royal guard at the North Court that a brief silence is to be expected. The clerk's log is reviewed monthly. The guard's hearing is the second instrument. Tobias remained my junior for another 14 months, and then he passed his examination and was appointed assistant keeper. He is now 33. On Friday of next week, when I formally place this office into the hands of my son, Tobias will read the order of succession aloud in the chamber, as the assistant always does, and his voice will be steady. He has not stopped a pendulum without authorization in the 4 years since. He will not stop one in the next 40. There is one more thing. 6 months after that Tuesday, at the spring quarterly inspection, I had recovered enough to climb the 204 stairs again under my own power. I made the inspection. The gears were running clean. The chamber log in Tobias's careful hand showed no further unauthorized intervals. The brass baseplate with the founder's name on it had been polished, as it was polished every April, and the founder's italic still ran true. I came down, and then in the late afternoon, when the cobblestones were warm from the day's sun, I walked across to the North Court, and I went up to Guardsman Pell at his post. I had been raised in this office to believe that a thank you owed to a man who has saved your work is a thank you carry across the cobblestones yourself, in your own coat, with your own voice. He did not move, of course. He stood as he had stood that night, eyes forward, white gloves at the seam, the rifle at his shoulder. I stopped in front of him at the regulation distance, and I waited a moment, because I had rehearsed what I would say in my workshop for 3 weeks, and I wanted to be sure I would say it cleanly. I said, "Guardsman Pell, the North Tower clock has chimed every hour since you wrote your memo. I am the senior keeper. I am here to thank you in person on behalf of my father and his father, who would have wished to be here. The mechanism is in your debt." He did not speak, he did not turn his head, but the smallest thing happened in the brass at his throat, a slight tightening of the chin strap as he swallowed once, and I understood that he had heard me and that he had received the thanks. I waited the proper count of 3, I inclined my head once, and I walked away across the cobblestones, and the chime above us struck 5 o'clock as I reached the colonnade, 2 strokes lower in pitch in the cooling air, and I knew without looking up that he had heard those too. On Friday next, when I formally hand the office to my son, I will climb the 204 stairs for the last time as senior keeper. I will be 70 then. My son will be 41, the age I was when my own father laid the ceremonial winding key in my palm and said the words his father had said to him, that the mechanism is older than us, that the office is older than us, and that the only honor any of us holds is to leave the chamber as we found it. I will stand by the chamber's high window, and I will look down at the north court, and I will see far below me at the regulation distance the immaculate figure of the royal guard at his post. It will not be Pell. Pell retired a year ago at the end of his full 30. The post is held now by a younger man in his 9th year, who by the protocol Pell's memo wrote into the standing orders is the second instrument of the mechanism above him. He will be listening. He will not know I am watching. The clock will chime the hour, 2 slow strokes for 2 o'clock in the afternoon, perfect in the cold air of the chamber and perfect, I hope, in the cobblestone court below. And I will think, as I do every hour now, that the office I am about to hand my son was very nearly lost in 90 seconds of silence one Tuesday morning 4 years ago, and that it was saved not by the keepers, who are the first instrument and who failed, but by the second instrument, by a man who stood 11 years at one quiet post, and who, on the night the first hand slipped, was listening. That is the whole of it. The chime has never skipped again.